Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peter Harland, who's going to talk to us about the 120-year history of the Kenora Rowing Club. So let's give Peter a warm welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I'm hoping that at the end of this, you'll have a little bit more understanding of rowing and maybe even be excited by it. In fact, it's 124 years, so I was underestimating it. But I want to take you back right to before the turn of the century, the last century, to the 1890s, when rowing was like the prize fighting of the water. And the top scullers and the top rowers were just like people bet on them. They were sort of heroes in their community. They were heroes in the country. And the incredible thing is that we had a world champion right here in Kenora. There. 1890 was when the rowing club in Kenora was first formed, called Rat Portage. And it must have been a successful club because the very next year, 1891, they had their first regatta. And in 1892, the Kenora Athletic Club was built. And this is what that first regatta looked like. Believe it or not, it was not just rowing. You can see some rowers there, but there was also canoe races. And look down at the bottom right-hand side, you can see that there are some log rollers because they put in log rolling contests as well. But this must have been a very successful venture, 1891, because it really got one or two of the town people interested. In particular, there was a fellow, I never knew him, there was a fellow called George Drury of Drury Drive fame. And for those that don't know, George Drury was a mover and a shaker, and he was very entrepreneurial. Originally, he came from St. Paul, Minnesota, and he had seen a curling club that was built on piles over the Mississippi. George Drury he owned a number of stores and hotels in Kenora. Plus, he was also president of the rowing club, president of the curling club. He became very involved with the agricultural club and all sorts of trading clubs. And George Drury thought that they should really build a rowing club. But initially, it had to be a curling club. And believe it or not, in Mississippi, in St. Paul, George Drury had seen a curling club built on piles overlooking the Mississippi River. So he thought that he could replicate that in Kenora. And for a while it was a curling club. It was predominantly a curling club until around about the middle of January, early February, the ice turned to little hills and rucks and cracks. I'm not certain how many years it went on being a curling club, but subsequently, it became not just a rowing club, but it became the sort of the center of the town entertainment life. And if you look at that, I think that's an extraordinary building, and it must have been inspirational for rowers here's the other side of it, looking at right down on the water, round about where the Bank of Nova Scotia is now. And this was built in 1985, 89, and survived to 1970. Bill Cameron tells me that when crews were training, they would sleep in a back room. There's a picture of, you can see there's more than just rowing and canoeing, there's also sailing. Now, rowing was, it was a sort of a prima donna sport. And this guy, also a Canadian, was the prima donna of rowing, not only in Canada, but pretty well the world. This guy was Ned Hanlon. He was born and raised in Toronto. He raced off Toronto Islands, and in 1980, he became the world champion. That means that people bet on him to win, and he won a whole pile of money by becoming world champion. He remained world champion till 1985. Did he row in Kenora? He didn't race in Kenora, but there is evidence that he rowed exhibitions in Kenora. And certainly he was a great friend of another Kenora person, Jake Goddard, that we're going to talk about in a minute. One of the great things I should perhaps mention about Ned Hanlon is that he was the father of the sliding seat. You can see he's got his legs bent right the way up, and those, up until this time, if you really wanted to go forward, you wore leather breeches and you put grease on them, and your seat was a long, shined up plank also with grease on it, so that you slid up and down on your butt. However, this guy he mastered the art of the rolling seat. So he was sitting on a platform with little wheels on it, and he also had swiveling oarlocks, and he had his feet firmly planted in his. So he was quite extraordinary, and he was a world champion for 5 consecutive years. I think that Jake Goddard came to Kenora because there was such a large and opulent-looking rowing club. And he was probably told to go there by his friend Ned Hanlon, who he had beaten a few years before. So this guy, Jake Goddard, had beaten an Australian called James Stanbury in London in 1896. And by beating the world champion, you then become world champion. Again, pretty important. Huge amounts of money put on who was going to be the winner, and you yourself made quite a lot of money. And I suspect that the taxes were not as great as they are these days, because Jake Goddard bought into this hotel on Main Street, kitty corner to the Kenrisha. This is the Russell House. And it's where Movies on Main is right now. And it boasted 60 opulent bedrooms, plus very fine dining room, a billiard room, a well-stocked bar, and also it offered free rides to and from the railway station. And I think that he was also cashing in on the mining boom that was going on, the gold mining boom that was going on at that time. And he became a successful businessman. Now, he'd been a world champion for 4 or 5 years, and no one could beat him until an Australian came along. And his name was George Towns, and he came into town with his handler, a fellow called Sullivan, and they raised money, and the town raised money for a total of $2,500, $2,500, to be split 50-50 in a world champion race. And this was the start of the world champion race. And everybody in town thought that Jake Goddard was going to lick this Australian. It happened in September 1901. So everybody thought that Jake Goddard was going to lick this guy. However, when the race did start, I'm going to quote from, people started to change their minds, so perhaps they put their money in the wrong spot, because I quote from the Rat Portage Miner of September the 10th of that year, talking about Towns. Those who saw him stripped marveled at the play of his muscles, the breadth of his shoulders, and the magnificent musculature development of his small but perfect physique. Makes you want to run out and see if he's still there, right, ladies? George Drury and the Australians' handler Sullivan tossed a coin, and Drury won, so Goddard got to choose the side that he wanted. And there was a Mr. Galt around at the time, and he said, this is again reported, so he started the race, and again the reporter says, Towns sprinted from the first dip of the oars at 35 per minute. Pulling like a demon for the first minute, he quickly opened up a gap, which was never closed. And what they did, they rowed out past Bush Island towards Coney, and then for a mile and a half. Then they did the turnaround. Sorry, that was the turnaround there. And George Towns is firmly ahead by 3 lengths. And then they sprinted back, and George Towns eased up a little bit, and Jake Goddard, going past Bush Island there, caught up to him a bit, but was never able to catch him completely. The spectators, who crowded every available point of vantage at the finish, were disappointed to see Jake had no possibility of catching his man. Towns finished strong with 2.5 lengths to the good. And then after the race, the two scholars backed up and shook hands. And I tried to find a good picture to show this. It wasn't photographed, but there is a painting. But it went on to emphasize that Jake Goddard was not only a fine gentleman, but real sportsman. And this is what the race looked like at the finish. Doesn't it look magnificent? And here was another player in the game. This guy was Jack Hackett. He peaked a few years later, but at one time he was described by a U.S. paper in Minneapolis as the fastest amateur sculler in North America. And what I really want to show you is this picture, which shows him taking his boat out of the water, and you can see why they were called needle boats. Some of them were so light that they were covered in a layer of paper. So Kenora, having an active rowing club, became an active member of the NWIRA, and you're going to hear a little more about this. NWIRA stands for Northwest International Rowing Association. And this was a group of clubs formed in 1885, and Kenora joined in, says 1903 there. They held the first NWIRA regatta here in Kenora in the Town Bay in 1910. And that in 1914, Sir Thomas Lipton presented this cup to NWIRA. In fact, he presented it to a friend of his in Winnipeg called Con Riley. This is the largest silver sports trophy in North America. And this was the 1910 regatta starting off. And again, another picture of the 1910 regatta. Now, here was an important event. This was a big deal. 1914, the Duke of Connaught came to town. And in the picture there, you see the guy with his sort of trilby hat on. That's the Duke of Connaught. You say, who the hell is the Duke of Connaught? He was the Governor General. On top of that, he was the third son of Queen Victoria. And he was now the Governor General of Canada, and his real name was Prince Arthur. And he had just passed through Thunder Bay, which was not Thunder Bay then, and he'd given his name to Port Arthur Landing. And now he's made his way to Kenora, and it's 1914. That's an excuse for another regatta. On top of that, he's brought along his daughter, who was incredibly attractive. This lady was a real hot babe. She was so attractive that when they eventually got west to Edmonton and Saskatoon and so on, they asked her would she give her name to their local private regiment, and she said, of course. So that became the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry. So they had another regatta. Look at these eights. Those eights had to be brought in by train, because in those days they didn't have trailers. And again, I go to my source, Bill Cameron, tells me that he can remember the door being opened at the narrow end of the train, the end of the train, and shuffling the eight right the way down the train. And then the train would stop at a suitable point on the railway track, and the eight would be shuffled out, re-rigged, and put into the water. So there's a series of eights again in our town bay. And here's some sculls going by. Same regatta. So there's a sort of a rough history of the far past. But you can see why it sort of generated a lot of excitement, particularly if you had such a wonderful boathouse to sort of headline it. Now, there were a few sort of important years when the Kenora Rowing Club really excelled. 1930, there were only 15 members in the club, but they won the Lipton Cup. The Lipton Cup was awarded to the club with the most points. And some of you may I'm not going to read them all out, but generally speaking, most of the people in the club had names like Bergman, Cameron, Gibson, Malouche, Carlson, even a Hackett or two. I was going to mention, Jack Hackett moved to the south end of the lake, where he had a son who used to come up and row in Kenora, and the son's name was Harland Hackett. And we include this picture because, again, it includes a bunch of Bergmans and Gibsons, and we like the picture because they look so handsome. And might I add, manly. Then again, in 1936, the club again won the Lipton Cup with a larger group. I don't recognize too many people at the back there, other than I think Lessingo's in there somewhere. I can't see the picture very well from here, but you can see some of the names below. And again, this is a couple of Bergmans, Gunnar and Herb. And again, that's included because it was such a nice picture. Kenora Senior Skulls. So the club limped on. There were the high times and then there were low times. And it eventually became apparent that there was too much wave action in the area of the bay, and the building was getting old. So in 1970, the old building was torn down, and this building was built on Norman Beach, and it became. How am I doing for time? Oh, we're okay. And it became the center of rowing activity. And in fact, this was a little before they moved, but I include this picture because it became a very famous picture. This picture won in 1953, the U.S. Sports Photograph Journalist Picture for the year. And you may recognize some of the people in here because it's 57, I'm sorry. right to your very far left, you could only see half his face, is a fellow called Noel Dunford. And my wife said, "Oh, Noel Dunford, he was good looking." And he played for the Bombers. I'm sorry, I never knew Noel Dunford, but I'm sure he's very good looking. And and there you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. The number 4 man in from the far side is Don Cameron, who was a young row at that time, and then just in front of him, Don Young, I believe, and the guy who's stroking the boat is Porky Crandall, and then you can see the cox is Jim Francis, and if I'd had time, and you could have seen Jim Francis in some of the earlier pictures when he was standing up at the 1936 rowing club. So this picture was blown up and was displayed at Union Central Station in New York. So Kenora, I love this picture. This picture sort of resembles a striking change in the rowing club, because up to this time it had been completely male, and now it's female, and I think it just looks wonderful. For those of you that might want to know who's in it, there's to the far left in the bow and the 2-seat is a couple of Boulanger girls, and Janet and Marie. Is it Marie? Janet Marie. And in the 3rd seat is Bob Bowick. Is Ruth here? I should have warned Ruth that I was going to. Is Bob Bowick. And Robin Malmo is in the stroke seat. And that's Bud Malmo, her father, who's coaching them and holding the boat. And he went on to become, for years and years, he was the president of the Ontario Rowing Association. So I really wanted to sort of include him. Coxing is Lees, who was Dufresne in those days, now Lees Trent. So the Norman Beach went on for a number of years, but what happened was more boat traffic, more rocking and rolling, and I think it was Jim Rivington and maybe Nick Van der Zand who said, let's get over to Rabbit Lake. And in fact, they held an NWIRA regatta in Rabbit Lake in 1980. However, it took another almost 20 years before Suzanne Broughton said, let's build a boathouse on Rabbit Lake. And she was able to bring up a business plan which showed that if you built a boathouse on Rabbit Lake, people would come. If you build it, they will come. And not only that, you could make money from it. And this is what the new boathouse looks like. So this is where we are now. We're away from the waves and the plains of Norman Beach. And I just wanted to point out that Rabbit Lake is an ideal regatta site. We also do a lot of learn to row, and we also send juniors off to regattas. You can see this here is the Red River, one of our ladies' eights going off to the Red River. But as I say, regattas are big business for our club. And in fact, this year we're hoping to hold 3 because they've got a really energetic executive. On the right there, you can see our friend Bud Malmo again. He's the guy who's singing out the orders to put boats onto the lake, and we provide referees. Here's Lee's again, and some races there. And then at the end of the regatta, it's medal time. And on the right, you can see 2 smiling Kenora faces. You might recognize Sue Strait and Joanne Haynes. But everybody, it's a great place for a regatta. Clubs love to come here. And sometimes it's so much fun, we just sort of mix up a crew. Here's a Duluth person who's fit into one of our boats. Laurie Laffin is stroking there, who happens to be Bud Malmo's daughter. But this is what we all yearn for. This is why we row. We're looking for tranquility, get away from the crowds, leave the cell phone at home, and have some blissful time out on the calm waters. So the club has changed. We're now predominantly female. We are more recreational, less competitive, although we always hope that there's a competitive element. We have a junior coach who tries to get the juniors to work hard and enter them into regattas. And that brings us up to date, almost. Just to mention, in 2002, Kenora was selected to be the Canadian Masters Regatta site. And coming up in 2017, we have been selected by the Manitoba branch of the Canada Games, Summer Canada Games. Manitoba has decided that Rabbit Lake is a way better regatta site than anything that they can provide in Manitoba. And so 2017 will be the location of the rowing regatta in Kenora. So, thanks very much.
I think we probably have a minute or so for a question, if you're comfortable with that, Peter.
I don't know. Fire away. Try me.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, sir.
Where is the Gold Cup located today?
Where is the
Lipton Cup.
The Lipton Cup? It's usually kept in a place where it used to be Winnipeg because the main committee was in Winnipeg, but I think it's now in Minneapolis because the head of the NWIRA committee is located in Minneapolis. So I think all the trophies see daylight only about one day a year. And there are I'll guess, 25 trophies, of which the Lipton Cup is an aggregate score of everything.
Good question. Anyone else? No?
Do you want to know what happened to Princess Patricia? She married a commoner. And having married a commoner, she had to lose her princess-ship. But if you look at pictures of her, you can see why she generated an awful lot of excitement.
On behalf of the committee and certainly all of us here today, I'd like to thank you, Peter, for coming. And I do have a card here and a large medal. It's not the most coveted medal in the history of any event, but it's certainly coveted for all of our speakers.
I'll wear it with pride.
Thank you very much.